Let's take a look at some of the differences between vector files and rasterized files. I have three objects on this document. The top one is a vector file, the middle one is a rasterized high-resolution file, and the bottom one is a rasterized low-resolution file. Let's zoom in and take a look at what happens to these files as I get closer. They begin to pixelate. This is the low-resolution file. So we're starting with this bottom one. And the closer I get, the more I notice the imperfections this file has. Now, if I zoom in on the high-resolution file, in the same place, we'll zoom in on this E, on the word the, notice that you can still see imperfections. You can still see that it's pixelating, but it's not quite as bad or quite as noticeable as the low-resolution file. Now let's take a look at the vector. No pixelation at all. It's just crisp and sharp all the way through. Why is that? Well, the computer looks at a vector file much differently than it looks at a rasterized file. With a rasterized file, the computer refers to a map of dots, or dots per inch, to display the image. You may have heard of DPI. Well, that stands for dots per inch. Each inch has a certain amount of dots going this way and a certain amount of dots going this way. And then, of course, it's filled in. And each dot is stacked closely right next to the other, and each dot contains a color. This is a one-color logo, so some of the dots would be white and some of the dots would be blue. Well, in a low-resolution file, there are fewer dots in each square inch. So if this were a 150 DPI rasterized file, then we would have 150 dots going this way and 150 dots going this way in each inch, which is much fewer than this one. And the end result is the dots appear to be further apart, and you don't get as much detail. So in between the color changes from one dot to the other, you're able to see some of the what would appear to be pixelation or imperfections because of it. In a vector file, the map is much different. The computer views this as shapes. Instead of dots, if I were to click on one of these letters, you can see that the computer wraps around it, because in a vector file, the map used is much different than the map used in a rasterized file. So there are things that I can do with this vector file that I can't do with the rasterized file. Of course, the most obvious is I can resize this and not lose quality. But notice that if I try to click on one of these letters, the computer doesn't understand that I'm trying to select a shape like it does over here. It tries to select the whole picture. Now, if I go and try to change the color, it doesn't let me because it doesn't understand it that way. With a vector file, I can click on one of these shapes and I can change the color. See, I can't do that over here because the computer doesn't understand that. So, in particular, in the case of logos, it would be a great idea to use vector files. Also, in the case of text, it would be a great idea because in the world of print, vector files come out much sharper than rasterized files. But you wouldn't always want to use a vector file. You might want to use a rasterized file for a photograph because it would appear more natural. It would have a more natural feel to it. And I've got an example here. Now here's a photograph that is high resolution, and then this is a vector of that photograph. This is a high res of that photograph and a low res. So low resolution, high resolution, and then a vector. Well, the vector file sees it as shapes. So if I click on one of these parts, I can click on it, and sure, I can change the color. And if this were something that I was going to put in a logo or something, I would definitely want to use a vector file. But notice that it has an effect. It almost looks like paint daubs or something. It just doesn't have that natural photograph feel that I get with this photograph here. So there are some cases where you're going to want to use a rasterized file. And rule of thumb, you want to go with the highest resolution. Notice what happens when I go zooming in on these horns. We lose some of the sharpness when we zoom in, but it's not terribly bad. If I go into the low resolution file, it's much more noticeable. The pixelation is much worse. Now, there are times when you're going to want to use low resolution instead of high resolution. For example, if you're building a website and you don't want to occupy too much server space, you might want to go with a lower resolution, but you would be sacrificing the quality. In the print world, you would not want to go with low resolution. You'd want to stick with at least 300 dpi.